Welcome to the Art of Conscious Living. My guest today is Karen Wilhelm Buckley. She has a program called Leadership for Women, and I'm very pleased to have her in the studio today to be able to speak to her about all of her wisdom of empowering women. Thank you, Karen, for joining me today. How are you today?
I'm very good, thank you. Thank you, Victoria.
So your work is very incredibly wisdom-based, and you have an incredible story to tell. It started so many decades ago.
I did indeed.
And it's about the intelligence of women in the workforce and bringing the empathy and the connection in the workforce. And the Fortune 500 companies need to be honoring more women.
Absolutely. Every company needs to be utilizing women more completely, and women need to understand their own wisdom and their own leadership and learn how to move that forward. So I've been working for years, decades, with developing leadership and the wisdom in leadership, whether it's in a large Fortune 500 company or a small nonprofit, and recognizing that a good leader has access to and a capacity to not only be smart and intelligent, but to be wise. And there was a point, I can tell you more story later, but there was a point in 2002 where I recognized that although I'd been working with women leaders, had been helping to cultivate them in companies for many, many years, that the wisdom of women was basically invisible on the world stage. And I was shocked to recognize that. When I looked at all the conferences on wisdom and leadership, they were 80 to 90% men speakers. When I was involved in helping to put on a conference, and when the staff brought in a slate of 90% men speakers, and this was a conference on conscious living and business.
Which decade was this?
This was in 2002. And these were amazing, competent staff, great people, and they brought in a slate of all men. Almost all men, not all men. And something in me, you know, when you just go crazy. It was one of those moments where I thought, how can women not be being recognized in this field of integrating spirit and business, consciousness and business? What is at the root of this? Because I'm a researcher and I wanted to know what's at the root of it. So I began doing a whole lot more research, including looking in the dictionary for the definitions of wisdom. And I found that there was a marvelous definition of wisdom about a way that we contribute in smart and prudent ways. And then right below that was wise man, a discreet and prudent man well versed in the affairs of the world. Great. Sounds like a very smart leader, discreet, prudent, well versed in the affairs of the world, ready to make a contribution. Right before that, below that, I looked expecting to find a definition for wise woman. There was none. I looked in one dictionary after another, after another. My daughter's dictionary from high school, finally, I went down to the library, finally, I found a definition for wise women in my Oxford Historical Dictionary. And that definition had us out in the woods making charms and generally being ineffective. And I realized in that moment, if you have difficult decisions to make in a company, if you have leadership that needs to be provided, who are you going to call? A man who's discreet, prudent, well-versed in the affairs of the world, or a woman who's out in the woods making charms? If that dictionary is representative of our fundamental definitions about wisdom, then we are living within that mindset and restricting what could be possible.
So in essence, Karen, what we're saying here is that the outdated model of thinking needs to be looked at and revised. We need to empower women, and I think it's very important at this moment in time that women actually take that leadership in the world stage. We have, well, let's speak of Hillary Clinton. the Secretary of State and the role, where she was showing tears. And is that appropriate to do that? Or was it not appropriate to do that? Is it appropriate to be a woman within a man's world? Or is a woman really in a man's world? Or is it time now to define a woman's world?
Those are 4 really great questions. The first being, and let me skip over the tears for a second and go to the bigger question of whose world is it? I do think that we've had the ocean we've swam in, particularly in the workforce, even though women have become equal and they've made headway, they have still been swimming in the man's ocean. And what we haven't recognized as women is that we're actually in another ocean. We have some different priorities and different values and perceptions and visions that are useful to us and are very useful to companies at this point. And part of what that means is bringing our emotional side, bringing our compassion, our caring, our wide range of vision. We see the implications of something. We look at the broad picture. I was just listening to Chief Justice Sotomayor on the radio on my way here, and she was talking about her new biography, which I can't wait to read, how vitally important it is that all of us look at the implications of any decision that we make. That's what women are excellent at. We're always looking down the road at this step and then that step and that step. Who's going to be impacted? How's it going to feel? How's it going to work? And by the time we do that, we can sometimes seem as though we're complicating the issue. And we need to learn how to bring that in to the conversation in such a way that it's useful and doesn't feel like we're taking things off track.
Yes, it's about grounding, and it's also about using the tools and acknowledging the intuitiveness that women have. Women have an intuitive nature. They naturally tap into it in a very natural way. Men, on the other hand, could have a disassociation of that.
They can.
And they can also be very intuitive.
Yeah.
But women are naturally prone to have that access to that.
I'd say there's a greater percentage of women that have that natural access to their intuition, not 100%. I've worked with many women leaders for whom that's a stretch. And when I spoke before about the 2 different oceans, it's not that men and women don't swim in the same ocean. Ultimately, there's one ocean. But it's helpful for us to recognize that if a woman doesn't recognize, for instance, just as you're saying, that her intuition is a gift and a contribution that she has to bring into the workplace or to bring into political discussions, then she'll shut off that natural capacity. Or if she does get an intuition, she won't have really thought through how to contribute it in a way, again, where it's useful, where it translates into the workplace environment. The workplace also needs to make a lot of changes in that we need to be looking for and drawing from the wisdom, the intuition, the perception and vision that women have, so that in the workplace there's actually room for that. But it's also men that want to have that capacity to feel and to show their emotions. I was speaking to a large conference of employee assistance professionals many years ago, and I was telling the stories of women leaders around the world who are smart, strategic, making a big difference, and at the same time they're wise and intuitive and tender and emotional, and how difficult it is for them when they're working in an environment where that's not welcomed, and how part of their leadership gets left behind, part of the fuel that makes their leadership happen. And some of the men in the audience who are deeply caring people who care, who work in companies to help people that are drinking too much get help, or people that are having emotional issues because of a divorce to get help. So these are people with a lot of feeling. They said, but that's true for us too as men, because we're deep feeling men. So I've recognized over time that my commitment is to wise leadership and a big chunk of my devotion is to women and developing women leaders, because I think that's the part that's been out of balance. That's the part that we don't have working side by side yet.
So how do you take a woman who has been the homemaker and take her now to the workforce? And what training, what is involved in that? Where is the transition? Many women who have no longer need it in the household. Their children have grown up. They're at college and university. They left the home nest. And now they want to return back to the workforce. So how is this possible?
That's a great question. I have actually one of my executive coaching clients right now is an individual woman. She is not within a company. She's been very active in community service. Very active, helped found a school, is on the board of the school, helped in all kinds of community endeavors, but not paid for it. And she and her husband divorced, her son is grown, and she's ready to work. And she called me and found out about my work and called me and said, help. And we've been working together for about 2 years now. And so what I've helped her do is identify the skills that she used in the home and that she used in those non-paid positions. And we pulled those strengths and skills. I always like starting with the best of who we are and what we're about. And we've all got so many strengths and so much of a great foundation. But often, particularly as women, the dialogue that runs more through our heads is, I'm not enough, rather than the dialogue being, oh, look at how well I did that. I really like that, actually. So she was somebody that needed to make that shift from I'm not enough and wearing those lenses and she couldn't see very well what she had done to, oh, look at that I've done. Oh, and wouldn't it be fun to learn this as well? So she has now made this progression to where she has a confident sense of herself, a confident sense of what she's capable of. She's gone and taken some professional development programs. She joined us in the women's retreat in Molokai last year in May, and she's going to be coming again this year. Very excited to know herself as a leader and as a woman with a contribution to make, whether that be in the workplace or the community. And now she's in the middle of designing that next job and where she's going to go.
And what could that next job be, Karen?
For her?
Yes.
Well,
for example.
Oh my gosh, she could go into any company because her skills are transferable in terms of founding an initiative, forming a board, working. She could go to work in any nonprofit where she had a particular emphasis or agreement with her or passion for the mission of that nonprofit. She could also go to work as a coach. She's very astute, very smart. Turns out she's always had all kinds of friends that she's been supporting and helping them find their own potential. It's been a natural gift of hers. She could be a teacher. She's actually talking with a local center there and looking at becoming a teacher within that in some of the art of living well and living with awareness and a greater capacity to be present for others and for the work that's here to be done. So she has lots of possibilities. Somebody with a more scientific or math orientation might have different possibilities.
So it sounds like your company, Leadership for Women, is all about your grassroots effort of coming to terms with realizing that women need to have their place in the world. And it's a new world we're entering into now. We're in the information age. Mm-hmm. It's a new time, and it's about honoring that and respecting that.
Mm-hmm. And first and foremost, it's about women honoring and respecting who they are, their wisdom, and their gifts. And that, when we do that, we free ourselves up to respect other women. So we don't have to do the competition thing anymore. I mean, competition's fun, you know, if you and I are playing a game and we're both going for the win, great. But I don't have to cut you down to do it. And women have typically used that as a way to gain power or think they were gaining power.
And that is translated over from the mating and relationships.
True.
For finding a husband. And
Yep. Yep, into the workplace where it doesn't serve anyone. It means that the younger women coming in don't get mentored and brought forward, and their true gifts and talents don't get recognized. They don't have the champions and mentors that they need.
So the new world would look like what?
Well, the new world would not be an opposition of men and women. So that's very important to say. Men have not done anything wrong, and as women, we don't need to assert ourselves into the workplace. What we need to do is find our own sense of feminine wisdom, our own sense of capacity and knowing, and open our heart to the love that's there, and trust the intelligence that we have, the great strategic thinking that we do, and bring that into our leadership. And the way I define leadership is the willingness and ability to do that which matters the most to us. So what matters the most to you? Here you are, running this gorgeous show. That matters to you. That's providing leadership. That's you being the leader you're here to be.
Absolutely.
And for each of us, we have a different passion, a different sense of what matters so much to us that it brings tears to our eyes. We care so much that we'll be up at all hours doing whatever it takes for it to happen. And when we can give ourselves to that, then we become the leader that the world needs, and the world needs women leaders.
Karen, there was a recent study done in Sweden in the last years, and the women are now feeling very independent, and they're in the mode of revolting, where they're doing male bashing, and they're basically taking it to the extreme now, where they are feeling very aggressive, where they feel like they don't want to be in the kitchen and in the home, and as the maid for the homes. They are now feeling that they want to be extremely assertive. So I have a sense that there needs to be, of what you're saying and from your work, that it's all about balance. It's okay to be acting out in that way, such as the study that I mentioned here in Sweden, but it's about coming back to the middle ground of honoring the men, as you said, and finding not so much the differences, but what is the similarities and what we can offer each other. And then that can translate into the workforce and into careers and into making a new world. Because we are making the world now.
Absolutely.
For the future.
Yep. Yep. And we're either going to do it with our hearts and capacities open to each other, where we can have good conversations that actually come up with new solutions that help to actually solve these intractable problems, or we're going to continue to isolate and put ourselves in different camps. And if the women in Sweden are using their assertiveness to say, wait a minute, I don't need to follow someone else's definition. This is what I'd like. I'd like to be working in the workplace. Then that's great, but they don't have to be against other people to do that necessarily, if they know their own strength and their own capacity. So that's what happens if we can get a group of women together, like we're doing in Molokai. What happens is they start talking to each other. And one woman expresses her fears, and the other woman says, oh, there's no reason to be afraid there. I can see how talented you are. Go for it. And she can get over those fears.
So in essence, they perhaps are just acting out at this moment, and they're working it out within themselves in Sweden, that the women are revolting, and it's just a period of finding and calibrating themselves back to the balance.
It could be. I hope so.
Absolutely.
Because the other cost on that is, if as women we start asserting ourselves, we might lose our feminine wisdom. We might lose our capacity to be at home and raise the children well. And our children do need to be raised well. Our homes, our communities need to be tended. Look at the amount of resources that the smart, intelligent, remarkable women have brought into the communities. Fundraising for the schools, organizing initiatives, cleaning up the environment. Eleanor Roosevelt is the one that had the campaign against billboards and kept the garish billboards off the federal highways. Had she not been paying attention to that, can you imagine what we would have all the way across the United States? So it is up to women and men to pay attention at all levels, to the home, to the community, to the children, and to the workplace.
Which other women would be a good example that you would see on a world stage?
Well, let's go back to Hillary, because you asked earlier about her tears.
Absolutely.
And when she was at that moment, from what I understand, from the little bit we've got from the media that seemed clear instead of distorted, she was asked the question, how do you do it? And when they asked her the question, how do you do it? This was back in her campaign. They were asking her, how do you make it through all the raising a child, being a wife, being the wife of a president, all the other things you're involved in, being a senator, and now running for president.
And being a mother.
And being a mother. How do you do that? How do you do it, was the question that brought a tear to her eyes. I don't know many women that don't get a tear in their eyes when they reflect on that. How do I do it? I get up first thing in the morning, I try and meditate and exercise, and then I'm at the desk and I'm working that through, and then my kid has a paper that needs to be edited. He's in college, and I was editing a paper this morning between 7 and 8, and then I was on with a client, and then my sister's staying over, and I had so much fun being with her and my niece and my daughter, but then I had all this other work. You know, how do we do it? How do we do it? I thought that was a beautiful moment for Hillary, and for me, I think the polls, if I remember correctly, showed that her ratings began to go up at that moment.
And it showed her human side of her, that other people could relate to it.
Yes.
But on the other hand, it could also be looked upon as being weakness.
It could. And it certainly is not something for either a man or a woman to use inappropriate in a situation where there's not readiness, or in a situation where they're using it to manipulate. That doesn't work.
That's very
And I don't think she was. Whether or not there was readiness, I don't know. Clearly there wasn't on all the part. You can't walk into a corporate environment, let's say, or a nonprofit environment where their task there is to get the job done and put your emotions out in an unprofessional way. Just as you can't walk into those, well, you shouldn't. I don't know that you can't. It has been more accepted for men and women to walk into an environment of an organization where they're trying to get the job done and drive, be highly competitive, manipulative politically, putting other people down, putting themselves up. There's been a lot of that kind of activity that's gone on, and that has been more approved of, in a sense, than the emotional disclosure. But or showing tears, or showing how much you care about something, or even, back to your point earlier, showing how much intuition, how you might have an insight or an intuition that would be useful to consider. One of my corporate clients felt so badly when her company fell apart. She felt as though her intuitive thought, she had had an insight a couple months before, and she knew that it was a new way of thinking about the problem that could make a difference. And she had no way to bring it in to the meeting.
So she was not honoring that which she knew.
She was not honoring it, and there was no way within that organization to bring it in. Any new idea that you brought needed to be already demonstrated on a spreadsheet that it was a valid idea. And it needed to be weighed against the other strategies and ideas. I spoke in Rome last year at the Women's International Networking Conference, which is just a marvelous, marvelous conference, and Paris the year before that. And they, women there, the fundamental question they asked, after a keynote and a breakout and all kinds of discussions, the fundamental question they all kept coming back to was, how do I bring feminine wisdom into a male-dominated work environment? And I said, so what do you mean by male-dominated? How do I bring feminine wisdom into an environment where there are spreadsheets and everything's measured against the spreadsheet? Where there is politics and it's survival of the fittest, where there's competition rules out over good solutions, where the meetings exist to support status and increase status and hierarchy of position rather than to get the job done. How do I do that? It was a great question. How do I trust that it would be okay to bring my feminine wisdom in? I feel like I'd be vulnerable.
The question that begs to be asked is, how can a woman be a woman if it is a man's world, in the corporate world, having a career, and how can they be feminine? Do they have to wear a man's suit, such as Hillary Clinton? Often you see her in a sort of a mannish blazer type and black slacks and flat shoes, sort of copying what a man would be wearing, except for women. But yet, how can she embrace her femininity? And if you show a certain amount of cleavage, or any cleavage, it's looked upon as a no-no. It's looked upon as being distracting. A woman can't be that. My idea is that, what is this about? A woman is a woman, a man is a man. We're not to be hiding who we are. And are we doing it because of this Victorian age of thinking that women have to be hidden and not seen? And if they are seen, then men get distracted by that? So all of this has to be looked at, and this is a very important, meaningful conversation. I'm not saying that, yes, you should be Hollywood red carpet at a corporate meeting, but
that
you could
might
still
be distracting.
It could be very distracting, but there is a nice balance there where you could still be absolutely feminine and be who you are, and feel comfortable with that. That you don't have to tone it down, that you don't have to be buttoned up to below your chin and hiding everything. And actually, these are your actual assets, so why are you hiding them? And I'm not talking only about breasts, but I'm bringing that into the conversation here, because it is a reality here.
Well, we need to remember, in Victorian age, we couldn't show ankles, right?
Exactly.
They were too sexy. Part of it is the world is changing. And so there's a couple answers, as always. There's never a single answer to these kind of things. Number one, it might be strategic for a woman like Hillary Clinton to wear a suit that has a masculine cut to it and to have her hair short. When I worked in corporations, there were primarily men in those corporations. I would be running a meeting of, I mean, this still happens, although now it's very seldom that it's this many men, but I can remember a meeting in San Francisco, in one of the corporations in San Francisco. This was probably back in 1985, and I'd been working with the company for 3 years as an external consultant, helping them develop a company-wide communications plan. And I'd been working with regions, and I'd been working with headquarters, and we'd been developing this fantastic communications plan. One of the departments wanted to bring me in to help facilitate their integration of that plan. Great, it was going to be a 3-day meeting. I was excited about it. There were 75 managers that would be there from across the company. We were taking this communications plan and really rolling it out. I walked into the room and it was 75 guys and me. Okay, not unusual in those days, but you know, I didn't wear my hair down. My hair was back in a ponytail, or a low ponytail, you know, so it was very calm looking. I didn't wear something low and distracting. I wore something that was just still pretty, but it wasn't signaling I'm going to make my big objective was to get the job done, which was to help them integrate a coherent communications plan throughout the company.
But Karen, I want to question what you're saying is signaling. The signaling, can women be actually themselves?
Absolutely.
If there is some cleavage, or if they are showing their beautiful legs and they're wearing a very beautiful dress that is showing their curves and all of their beauty, can they be this? Or do they have to be, as you mentioned, of Hillary Clinton emulating a man?
I think it depends on the environment. You're asking a great question. Women must be women. The world is not going to be worth living if women aren't women and men aren't men, and we don't get to have some fun with all that. And today, in certain corporate environments, in certain nonprofit environments, in certain community environments, there are mores that don't lend themselves to that kind of more revealing dressing. That is not to say a woman can't do it. So I want to be careful here, really careful, because the women I know who are completely confident in themselves and centered in themselves, they're not against anybody, they're not using their way of dressing to be against, to push back, or to make themselves more. They're whole, they're confident, they're strong, they're beautiful. They wear unusual jewelry, they wear unusual coats. I have fabulous necklaces that I wear, I have silk long coats that I wear. All of that I can pull off in any environment now. I could walk in now into that room of 75 managers and wear anything I wanted just about and get away with it, because I've now got 20 more years of experience since that time. Almost 30. So I would walk in, and running that meeting would not be a problem. When I was 35, or however old I was back then, I felt like I needed to match the culture enough that that didn't become an issue and I can get the job done. But I have to say, what happened at the lunch when I asked where the closest bathroom was, and they said, there's not one on this floor. And I said, why not? And they said, it's the board floor. As if that explained it. There'd never been a woman on that board. Just as today, the percentage of women on corporate boards is very low.
What percentage would that be?
You know, I don't recall what it is. I'm very bad at numbers sometimes, but I think it's about 12 to 15%. Of the members of corporate boards are women, which is very comparable to the numbers of women in the House of Representatives and the Senate, and it's on average, and it's very comparable to the number of women in senior management positions in corporations, particularly executive management positions.
And let's speak about the cliches let's address them, where women, when they're speaking up, they're looked upon as a word saying that they are just being a bitch. They're being over the top. They're being emotional. Barbara Streisand has got that in her movies when she was a director and producer. Hollywood would not accept that. In the corporate world, other women who have been in power, they are looked upon as a threat, where if a man is doing that, they're looked upon as that they're just expressing their power. So let's speak about this.
Sure, you're exactly right. And women do need to recognize that there are still prevalent worldviews that bind us to be someone other than who we are in our full expression. Recognize that, know it, and know that you are limited. A great example, one of my women clients ended up with a severe neck problem, and we tracked it back to why. And it was because as she was making her way up the corporate ladder, and she would sit in the meetings nodding in responsiveness to any point of view that was put out at the table. It didn't mean she agreed. It meant that she was being a woman. She was being encouraging. She was being positive, nurturing, empathetic to their problems. She was nodding her head, as you so beautifully did, naturally, and she was told that she was passed over for promotion because she was wishy-washy. And when she narrowed down what it was that was wishy-washy, it was because she nodded her head at all the different points of view around the table. She had to learn to sit in a corporate meeting without showing emotion and without nodding her head. In doing so, she took away her natural movement and it created a tension in her neck that over the years caused her some pretty severe problems. Another woman had problems with her jaw and her face and realized that it was from sticking her neck out in these meetings. I remember, and she and I were laughing about this, I remember being a teenager and being determined to be respected in the meetings with men and with boys. And I remember I was on debate club, and I felt as though as a young woman I wasn't being respected at the same level. So I remember studying the men, how they furrowed their brow, raised their shoulders slightly, made themselves bigger so they could assert themselves in a meeting. I remember studying that until I knew how to do it. Now, that had a huge cost for me. I had to unlearn that because I was then always comparing myself with them, with the guys that were very macho, to see if I was enough, without realizing that I'm not macho. And I can do macho, but it's not my nature.
And what is your nature as a woman? Instead of emulating the man in a meeting, what would you bring to the table?
My hope would be that I would bring a very broad and wide judgment where I was holding many different perspectives, looking at what works, what doesn't work, and always keeping in mind what the task is that we have at hand, what the mission of the company is, what the values are. I tend to be very pragmatic, and I find that many women are. We want to know that we can get the job done, that we can get the work done, because we're working usually in an environment where we care. One of my clients is working on a national level at increasing the safe routes to schools so that children have an opportunity to walk to school and not just be driven, so that the built environment in those communities is conducive to community and conducive to children and families, mothers and fathers walking their kids to school, saying hello, waving to each other, being part of a community, that it's safe. Michelle Obama is, in her obesity initiatives and her health initiatives, pointing to the importance of safe routes to school so that children aren't sitting at home watching TV, eating foods, and then heading in the car to school and ending up gaining weight and not getting any exercise. Now that's a passionate company. They care so much about what they're doing. As executive director, Deb Hupsmith will either take on a more driving approach as she needs to, or she'll take on an approach that's softer, that's more feminine, that's more collaborative.
And who may she be?
Deb Hupsmith is her work. She's the executive director and founder of the Safe Routes to School National Partnership. And she's in the midst of producing huge results in the world and great happiness in lots of communities that are finding additional resources, additional strategies, additional ways to use the state and federal funding to create safe routes to schools, which creates healthier communities, creates healthier kids. So as a woman, she uses her natural capacity to bring and call on many different partners. When she put the partnership together, she did so drawing on all the bigwigs in the walking and biking movement, got them all together, got them talking to each other instead of competing. Many of them who came on her steering committee were actually in competition in their organizations, but she got them all on one steering committee, got them all working together. And I've had the great pleasure of working with her as a consultant, helping her build the organization over the last 3 years from 3 people to 23. I think she'll be up to 26 potentially this year. And with a remarkable budget, both from federal funding, state funding, and private foundations, because this is such an important piece of creating a world that works for everybody and a world that benefits. So she uses those feminine skills and talents. She's also really good at driving an agenda and making things happen, as that's what she needs to do too, or producing a result. So she has both her masculine and feminine sides.
Karen, would you share with me a conversation that you would be having with your daughter, that you would be sharing with her of things that you've gone through in your life that you would like to help her to perhaps be aware of, to avoid the pitfalls, to be... concerns would you be sharing with her at this point in time?
Oh, what a great question, because I do love my daughter. And she's been part of a number of my seminars, helped me write blogs and helped me edit newsletters and do all kinds of things.
How old is she?
She's 25 years old.
Okay.
Yeah. And, well, I think the conversation she grew up in, but that I continue to have with her is about, as a human being, developing your conscious ability to know who you are and how you are being in relationship to other people, to become aware of your judgments and your assumptions about people and the box you put them in that really binds them and you, makes you both so that you're not free to be who you are, and set those judgments aside so that you can really meet the other. In that meeting with the other, you can discover more about yourself. You can really see the other. You can expand your capacity for joy, for happiness, for relationships. I would speak with her about that. She certainly heard lots of stories about me being a tough woman in a man's world as she was growing up, because I was coming home and trying to soften and be a mom and walk down the street with her while she looked at the butterflies and the flowers, and I'd just come from a meeting where I was driving the agenda and pushing things along and coming up with strategies. And so I found it difficult many times to shift between those two different modes of being within myself. But I knew that if I didn't shift and become a mom, become a woman, she would not know how to do that. And I found lots of stories, fairy tales and things with strong heroines, and made sure she had those models, but also that she had the models of the women that were soft and nurturing and encouraging and empathic and really drawing forward.
And a key word would be to be very vulnerable.
Very vulnerable. The power of
and
vulnerability.
tap into that vulnerability.
Yeah. Brené Brown has done some beautiful work on vulnerability and the power and strength of that.
And who is she and what is her work?
Brené Brown has written a book, Daring to be Great. And you can find her. She has a wonderful TED Talk, a couple of them. And I recently got to hear her speak at Book Passages, one of my favorite bookstores. And she really spoke about her own vulnerability as a woman and as an academic and as a researcher, and how she went to find out what it was that would really create effectiveness and capacity for people to get the job done and to take risks. And what she found out about was the strength and power of vulnerability.
So getting back to your daughter, what
Yes.
are you very passionate about to be also sharing with her in today's world? We're in the information age. The world is in a crisis at this moment. It's just shifting everything of economics and rebuilding and restructuring. It's a global world. Mm-hmm. So perhaps you in your lifetime, you have not experienced that. In the previous decades, it was really not a global world. Mm-hmm. It was countries that were isolated to their own. But mm-hmm. we're entering in a whole time now that's completely different than we've ever known. Mm-hmm. So what would you share with her other than the wisdom that you said about mm-hmm. honoring herself and connecting mm-hmm. to herself and sharing that with others?
Mm-hmm. I would speak to that the real work is getting done now in the intersections between companies, in the intersections between people. No longer can, if a company has an initiative and the CEO has an initiative that they want to drive, they can no longer drive that down through their own company and just have it be accomplished for the most part, because that initiative generally crosses over and intersects with other companies. One department cannot be a stovepipe and work only within their department, because an initiative similar to the communications one we did that I mentioned earlier, those communications went across departments. So that capacity to work in the intersections, that capacity to work collaboratively, that capacity to generate the kind of quality conversations. I'm working with another organization right now that is a partnership that's struggling very hard to make the partnership work and really work that out. And they're vulnerable with each other, and they're mad, and they're strong, and they've got lots of visions and places they could go. And when they go into isolation, they're each a great leader, but they're young or they're immature in their capacity to work together as a partnership. And that's true for so many of us. It's in the relationships where things break down. And it's in the conversations, the good conversations that we have with each other, that public policy planning can be done, that smart decisions could be made, and that leaders become wise, that they can actually begin to access more dimensions of who they are and how they are in the world, and they can see more accurately what is going on. And they're not just in their heads with some fancy concept, but actually embodied in recognizing some of the consequences of decisions on the people locally and far. And I would encourage my daughter to be both, as I do, both as she is, both passionate about what she cares about. And she's an incredible cook, and she cares so much about the food industry and about good foods and healthy foods, and she cares about that tremendously. And to also be smart and strategic and put yourself in places where you'll be appreciated and where the kind of culture and company can enable you to get the job done that you're there to do. So look for the structure that supports you, the kind of behaviors of other people around you and your own, and the ways of thinking or the values that will enable you to get things done.
And I'd like to add that there should be a system of measured, to calibrate measured results. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And if you are having that system that you can rely on, that you can calibrate your measured results all the time, mm-hmm. then it's doable. There's something possible there. Yes. If not in that way that you mentioned, this company, the two sides are very powerful onto their own, but when they get together, they have nothing to rely on for their communication.
Very true. I speak a lot about managing agreements, not people. And that if we know what our deliverables are, we know what the measurable results are, and we're in agreement on that, we know what you're going to create, we know what I'm going to create, we know how long we're going to do it, we know how we're going to do it, then we can both be free to go do it. And you might do it differently than I do. But we can work that out as long as we're going to reach the result, and as long as the way you do it and the way I do it is supportive and works across functions or across roles. So the companies that I consult with, that's a lot of the conversation that we have, is how to build a culture of agreements so that a performance review isn't an evaluation that is scary to do once a year or boring to do or everybody dreads, but how can it be based on and an expression of the core values and mission and agreements within that company and within that role. So what you're doing is you create a learning organization. And for decades now, I've been studying and working with how to create a learning context within an experience within an organization, so that the potential for not only making minor change and incremental change can be turned into one of real potential of major change or transformative change, something that's beyond what we can imagine today.
And how do we honor the experiential in all of this?
Yes, yeah. And the embodied. And that's a lot of what women need to do, is bring their wisdom into their body. We are very embodied. Our wisdom is in our bodies. We experience things. We feel things. We sense them with our bodies. We're very kinesthetic, many of us. And to trust that body information, that body intuition.
Karen, we just have a few moments left, and I'd like to ask you to give me an example of an overview of leadership for women. What would be involved if a woman comes to your programs? What would she experience? What would be actually, and how long would it be, and what would she take away from that experience?
Okay. Thank you. There's 3 different ways that women are working with me right now. One is in the Women's Leadership Program, where they come in, and we will have the next one coming up this coming May in Molokai at the beautiful Hui Ho'olana Retreat Center. It's unbelievably gorgeous, and the food is so delicious. A woman there, this one, the theme is thresholds. So we're going to be looking at What are the places where we have held ourselves back? And how can we build strength within ourselves so that our capacity, our capability to take the steps that are ours to take, we begin to know that, we begin to develop the skills and the practices to keep that strong and to keep us strong. I mean, imagine if we woke every day and we had a strong sense of being enough and a strong sense of how we can take the next step and what to do. And we could create all kinds of great things in the world. Once we look at how to strengthen who we are and the best of who we are, we look at some of the ways we limit ourselves, some of the constraints we place, some of the beliefs that are in the way. And then in the Women's Leadership Program, we begin to learn the 9 facets of feminine wisdom, which is 9 facets that I've distilled with my partner, Faye Freed. We started the Wisdom Connection together, and Faye's off doing a different thing now, but I'm working on this book on the 9 facets of feminine wisdom, putting the hopefully finishing touches on that. And these 9 facets teach you about who you are as a woman and what your gifts are and what your challenges are, and trying to distinguish some of the elements of leadership from a woman's point of view rather than the majority of the literature is written from a man's point of view in terms of what is leadership.
Well, give me an example of some of the aspects of the women.
Well, I won't talk specifically about the facets because you need to come to the program to know that.
But a mere example of
Yes, for example, do you know about the study that was done at UCLA by 2 women who are stress researchers? And they looked at this study done by their male colleagues that concluded that in stress, what you do is fight or flight. And they looked at each other and they said, do you fight when you're in stress, or do you run away? And she said, no, I call my girlfriend. They realized that the majority of the tests and studies had been done on men instead of including women or asking the questions that would help women bring forward what we actually do. So they developed a whole study and ran it and discovered that women use a 3rd strategy primarily, which is the strategy of befriending. So if we're in stress, we reach out, and that's how we find our way. Once we know that as a woman, then when we go into stress as a leader, or we're all of a sudden in a hard position in our work or something, and it's hard to get this deliverable done, it's hard to meet this deadline, we can learn to reach out, because that's our natural strength and our natural gift, and we can have people already in place that we know we can call, we can text, we can say, whoop, help, come, please. So that's an example of the kinds of very pragmatic things that a woman can learn about women's leadership that will empower her. One of the women that I worked with was in one of the high-tech firms. She wasn't in a team that really respected or worked well with her style, and she wasn't respecting her own leadership. She really said, I'm not really a leader, other people are. She was passed over for promotion. She said, well, I really deserve to be because I work mostly behind the scenes. And he was someone who really works out front. And I was coaching her, and we were working together. And I said, well, how about if working behind the scenes and cultivating people is leadership? How would it be to completely redefine yourself as a leader with those being your strengths? We worked together over many months, and she came through the Women's Leadership Program. She left the Women's Leadership Program, and she went on to leave that position, interview for another one, and end up in an extraordinary high-level position in a national research firm as the chief officer of their IT. It was a leap, an absolute leap, because she came to recognize that what she does well as a woman leader, and when she then interviewed for the job, she could speak about it confidently from the perspective of being a leader. So I just get so excited. I spoke at Rancho La Puerta, which is a beautiful spa just over the border in Mexico. I don't know if you've ever been there, but it's just, oh my gosh, it's so gorgeous. And I spoke there last November, and there was a woman there who's a speechwriter for a woman CEO, and another woman who started, Myra Strober, who started the Center for Women's Research at Stanford. And both of them said to me, there's been a lot written on women's leadership, but no one has distinguished women's leadership as not being in opposition to men's leadership, but rather really looking at and defining what is a woman's wisdom, and how does that, if it's linked with her leadership, how does that create the kind of results that we all want to see in the world? And that's exactly what brings tears to my eyes. When I see a woman leader discover just how wise she is and learn to trust that and express it and act on it, I see the goodness that happens around her. I see the results that happen for her company. I see the growth that her company goes through. And there's a...
Well, Karen, it's been an absolute pleasure to speak with you. Your dynamic wisdom that you impart here in the world is very, very necessary, very important, and I honor that in you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Victoria.
Thank you. And from the Art of Conscious Living, do take care of yourself and take care of others.